Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. U.S. President Joe Biden hosted more than 100 world leaders at a virtual summit for democracy. And earlier in the week, the U.S. announced a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. Today, we'll discuss how these events will set the course for Northeast Asia as well as the Korean Peninsula. Joining me is Evans Revere, non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Revere served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Bruce Klingner is also with me today. Mr. Klingner is Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Mr. Klingner served as CIA Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the program. Thank you so much for your time today. And Mr. Revere, good to have you with us all the way from Spain.
Oh, good to be back. Good to see you.
First of all, U.S. President Joe Biden said he has hosted this virtual event, Summit for Democracy, in order to tackle the greatest threats faced by democracies today, adding that renewing democracy is the defining challenge over time. Mr. Revere, how serious are the threats that President Biden is talking about?
I think they're quite serious. And the fact that the President of the United States saw fit to convene a global summit on democracy in and of itself says that this is serious business that we're talking about. When you think about it, the challenges to democracy today are at least threefold. There's an internal challenge to democracy happening in a number of countries around the world, the United States in particular. There's an external challenge to democracy happening from a number of authoritarian countries around the world, including China and Russia. But there's also, unfortunately, I think, a crisis of confidence in democracy that is happening around the world, including in the United States and some places in Europe. And I think that's also having a tremendous effect on the evolution of democracy. But for me as an American, the challenge that worries me the most, quite frankly, is the internal one. And we saw on January 6th how powerful a challenge that is. And those events obviously are disturbing, were disturbing, and they're still unfolding in an important way. But to answer your question specifically, this is serious business for America and democracies around the world.
Mr. Klingner, Mr. Revere just mentioned about three challenges that democracies are facing. What do you think are the most urgent threats that democratic countries are facing right now?
Well, I very much agree with Mr. Revere, and perhaps it's because we've known each other for more decades than we care to admit that I also was going to mention three different threats, though slightly different. I saw it as military threats, and we certainly see that from North Korea to South Korea, Japan. China's military threats and intimidation of neighboring countries. Secondly, I would just see the rise of authoritarianism and intimidating tactics, which China is also involved in, and Russia, as we see in Eastern Europe. And then the third threat is the internal, which unfortunately, as Mr. Revere has pointed out, the U.S. is not immune to. And we've seen that challenge on January 6th and continuing. So, in the region, as we focus on the Korean Peninsula and the surrounding areas, certainly there are the military threats from North Korea, but also the intimidation tactics by China against South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, and Taiwan. So it's a very real threat throughout East Asia.
In his speech, President Biden brought up the authoritarian countries and their repressive policies and practices. While he did not specifically mention China or Russia, the remark was widely interpreted as targeting these two countries. Mr. Klingner, is President Biden trying to rally the leaders of the other countries to stand with the U.S. against China and Russia?
I would say that the president is trying to rally countries around the world to stand up for the values and principles that we share, that democratic nations share. It's not specifically against other nations, but it's against any nation that violates those principles or stands as a threat against those principles. So in the old days, it was the Soviet Union was a primary threat, military and authoritarian to not only its citizens and surrounding countries, but worldwide. And now we see that in Europe, President Putin is clearly hinting at threats to Ukraine and perhaps beyond. And China is very much the nation challenging not only Asian nations, but we're also seeing economic intimidation of nations in the Pacific and Africa and even Latin America.
Well, the Chinese and the Russians are well aware that we have a powerfully different set of values than they do, and that the United States is determined, as my colleague just said, to gather as many like-minded countries as possible to defend and protect and preserve the values that we share. And I think that is what's happening. Once again, I don't think there are specific targets, but I think there's a clear understanding by the United States, its allies, and its partners around the world that two of the greatest challenges that we face, whether it be in the military dimension, in the security dimension, the diplomatic area, or in terms of rising authoritarianism, are indeed China and Russia.
And South Korea and Japan also participated in this summit, and even Taiwan did. Mr. Revere, what is the meaning that this kind of summit could have, considering what is happening in Northeast Asia and on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, the fact that those three places participated in this summit of democracies is a powerful statement that democracy has taken root in East and Northeast Asia, powerful roots, if you will. I can't think of three more thriving democracies in Asia, quite frankly, than the three that you just mentioned. So it sends a strong statement to whether it's North Korea, to China, to Russia, that democracy has strong roots here, and that these countries are prepared to meet with like-minded countries to see what can be done, not only to maintain our shared interest in democracy, but to further it if possible. And I think that is a very good and a very positive message to be sending. And it also pushes back against those, including many Chinese scholars, who say that democracy is not a natural system for Asia and Asians. That couldn't be further than the case. And Japan and the Republic of Korea and Taiwan are strong evidence of that.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, what kind of implication does this have for the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think specifically having South Korea and Japan involved sends a signal that they will stand up for these values. And the question is, what actions will not only those two nations, but other nations take in the defense of the common values and principles we share? I think it's worth highlighting, particularly Taiwan's involvement. This is a strong signal of support by the United States for Taiwan at a time when we've seen rising intimidation through various tactics by Beijing against Taiwan. Just today, we see reports that Nicaragua has reversed its recognition of Taiwan in favor of China. So that's yet another dwindling number of nations that recognize Taiwan. So we've seen the U.S. In its joint statements with the leaders of Japan and South Korea this year expressing support for Taiwan, or at least the peaceful resolution of situations, and vow against the changing of the status quo through violent means, as we see that China has repeatedly threatened. So I think Taiwan's inclusion is particularly noteworthy.
Mm-hmm. China, Russia, and North Korea criticized the U.S. for holding this summit. Mr. Klingner, are we beginning to see some kind of a repeat of the Cold War here?
I think the phrase Cold War is overused, and we can even disagree about what the first Cold War was all about. That was an ideological struggle between the Soviets and its satellites versus the democratic nations, not only of the West, but of the world. And now, oftentimes, China or North Korea will use the phrase New Cold War as a way of trying to criticize the United States. They'll say the division of the Korean Peninsula is because of outdated Cold War thinking, when the division is because of the hostilities of World War II, and then many actions we can't get into here on the Korean Peninsula. So I think it's a long-time struggle of democracies against threats to democracies. We've seen that in the last century of the rise of authoritarian leaders in Germany and Japan and Italy. After that, we saw Saddam Hussein's threat to Kuwait and other nations, and the list goes on. And with history now, the current focus is predominantly China and Russia, but any other threat to democracies should also be taken into account.
Mr. Revere, is the word Cold War overused?
Yeah, I would agree with that. We're in a different situation than we were in 1945 or 1949 or 1953. Ironically, the two major competing powers, the United States and China, even though we have incredibly different political systems and political philosophies, we have a lot in common in terms of the ties of trade and human person-to-person links between us. That didn't exist in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So this is a very, very complicated relationship between the United States and China. And I think using the term Cold War to describe it doesn't quite work for me as a historian. It's apples and oranges. We're in a very different situation. That is not to underestimate the degree to which we have a serious and potentially dangerous competition between ourselves and the Chinese.
Just a few days ago, the U.S. decided to boycott the Beijing Winter Olympics diplomatically, citing China's human rights violations. Mr. Revere, we don't see this kind of a boycott that often, do we?
Yeah, this is not business as usual for the United States to take a step like this. It's been quite some time since we've done that. But I think it sends a very powerful message from the United States and from the others that have agreed to pursue a similar sort of boycott, a powerful message to the Chinese that their behavior, whether it's in the realm of their authoritarian system, their anti-democratic values, the oppression of minorities, the oppression of various groups in China, the horrific things that are happening, obviously, in Xinjiang and in Tibet, among other places, as well as Hong Kong, I should add, that this is not acceptable behavior. This is a violation of some fundamental international norms, and the United States is not prepared to conduct business as usual, if you will, in an environment where there are some egregious violations of fundamental human rights. And some people would even say crimes against humanity taking place in China. So I think at a bare minimum, it was important for the United States to move in this direction. And I'm pleased to see that a number of other countries are doing so as well.
I agree. It was, I think, a positive development by the Biden administration. I think it should have been done long ago. I think also there should have been a stronger movement, not only by this administration, but the preceding U.S. administration, to push the Olympics away from Beijing. But right now, this is, I think, the correct, though perhaps minimalist action by the United States. And it did lose some of its impact by coming so late, and even after a time when China said, well, your diplomats are not welcome. So I think it's something that all nations should sign on to. And it's different from a total boycott in which the athletes would not have been able to participate, as we saw in the Moscow and Los Angeles Olympics years earlier. So this way, it doesn't penalize the athletes who have spent, in some cases, their lives preparing for these games. But it sends a signal that Beijing's behavior against human rights is not acceptable. Now, when we think of how for years that South Africa was not allowed to participate, its athletes not allowed to participate because of apartheid, and yet North Korea is allowed to participate, even though its human rights atrocities are far greater than that we saw under South Africa. So I think that's another issue that should be addressed. And in the future, I think the voting members of the International Olympics should not allow the games to take place in such authoritarian countries as China.
A senior official from the Biden administration told VOA the U.S. has consulted with allies and partners and informed them of the decision on the diplomatic boycott. And the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada have decided to join the U.S. Many are curious to find out what South Korea and Japan are going to do. And South Korea's position is now that they're going to make their own judgments. Mr. Klingner, is South Korea put in a difficult position?
I think South Korea has put itself in a difficult situation. I believe I just saw that South Korea decided that it will continue to participate with the diplomats in the Olympics. I'm not sure if that report is confirmed. And I think in many cases, Seoul is afraid of economic intimidation and retaliation by China, as we've seen China take actions against not only South Korea, Japan, Australia, and other countries when they do a political or a diplomatic initiative, China is very willing to respond economically. So South Korea may be afraid of its reliance on Chinese trade, but I think democratic nations need to stand up for doing the right thing, even if that does have consequences at times.
Mr. Revere, what do you think the U.S. is expecting South Korea to do?
Well, I think the United States is expecting South Korea to make its own decision as a partner and ally and a sovereign country. But I think in the hearts of many American officials, and as a former official, it's certainly in my heart, I'm hoping that South Korea will stand fast in terms of its support for its own democratic values, its own support for freedom, and will remember how it got to be the country it is today because of its turn to democracy a few decades ago. I think it's important for countries around the world, democracies, to stand up for the principles, their founding principles in terms of how they got to where they are today. And I think it's important for South Korea to do that as well. But this is a decision for a sovereign government to make. But once again, I hope, as someone who has a lot of experience in Korea, that those arguing for Korea to stand up for what it believes in terms of democracy and freedom, that South Korea will do the right thing.
While the South Korean officials didn't say it publicly, it was widely reported that the Moon Jae-in administration was hoping to push the end of war declaration during the Olympics. Mr. Revere, is this a lost opportunity for South Korea?
Well, I think the fact, I would put it a little bit differently. I don't know if it's so much a lost opportunity as I think it's an opportunity for South Korea and other countries to avoid making what I think is a fundamental mistake in terms of our respective policies towards North Korea. If the goal is the denuclearization of North Korea, the unilateral issuance of a peace declaration or an end of war declaration with a country that has become a de facto nuclear weapon state and is determined to remain a de facto nuclear weapon state, that would be a tremendous mistake and would, in effect, lock in the permanence of North Korea's nuclear weapons. Why would North Korea, a de facto nuclear weapon state, in the future want to give up its nuclear weapons if the United States, the ROK, and perhaps others have declared that the war is over? Where's the incentive for North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons? So I think we've all done South Korea a favor, quite frankly, by slowing down this speeding train of an end of war declaration, which I think would be a fundamental mistake and would also undermine the stability of the US-ROK alliance and undermine the rationale for the continued US military presence in South Korea.
I think what I found puzzling is, on the one hand, President Moon, Minister of Unification Lee, and others will publicly highlight the transformative effects that such an end-of-war declaration would have. It would be a major jump forward in denuclearization and dialogue and transform the relationship on the peninsula. At the same time, more privately, they will talk to U.S. officials and others about really highlighting the uselessness of such a document. They'll try to convince the U.S. to sign it because it's only a simplistic diplomatic gesture. It has absolutely no effect on the real world, including U.S. forces and North Korean forces. So why not sign it? Well, I would say for that very reason. If it has no real effect, it carries the risks of creating a domino effect or a political pressure to reduce U.S. forces or reduce the overall Allied deterrence capabilities before the threat to the peace has been addressed, which is the North Korean conventional forces threat to the South, not only nuclear and missile forces. So I think instead of a simplistic document that we hope will lead North Korea to act differently than all the other pieces of paper it signed, that we should instead incorporate it as part of a comprehensive denuclearization accord as a peace treaty, which would require addressing the conventional force threat to the South, much in using the measures we did in the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, as well as the Vienna Protocol of the Confidence and Security Building measures. So I think simple in this case is not a good idea.
And China said it is hoping the Olympics can contribute to the development of inter-Korean relations. And earlier, China showed its support for the end war declaration as well. Mr. Klingner, what do you make of what China is saying?
Well, China has been advocating on North Korea's behalf in many forums, including the UN Security Council, for many years. Some had hoped that the Beijing Olympics would be a follow-on to the Peace Olympics, which occurred in South Korea just a few years ago. But North Korea is precluded from participating in the Beijing Olympics because it boycotted the Tokyo Olympics. So, the fact that the U.S. is hesitant to jump on board with an end-of-war declaration is not the reason that we will continue to have a stalemate on the Korean Peninsula. That's because of Pyongyang's continuing refusal to engage in dialogue, let alone negotiations, with either Seoul or Washington, and its continued violation of UN resolutions, not only through repeated missile launching, but also the continued existence of its WMD programs.
Mr. Revere, what is China's intention behind a statement like this?
Well, there's more than a dollop of cynicism when it comes to China's position on all of this. And as Bruce suggested a moment ago, part of Beijing's game plan is to be supportive of its treaty ally, North Korea. Beijing knows extremely well that an end-of-war declaration, a peace declaration, would strengthen North Korea's hand in a very important way, and it would undermine the rationale for the continued presence of U.S. forces in the Republic of Korea, and that, of course, accords with China's own interests. So certainly what the Chinese are doing is showing solidarity with their North Korean ally and maintaining a level of influence in Pyongyang. But at the same time, the Chinese know well what a high priority this is for the Moon administration in Seoul. And so this is an attempt by the Chinese to ingratiate themselves, if you will, with the Moon administration in its waning months in office here, and to throw a bone, if you will, to the South Koreans, thereby maintaining influence not only in North Korea, but in South Korea as well. And so I think the Chinese are playing a very smart and cynical game here. But I suspect smart people in all the other capitals know that at least as well as I do.
And my last question for today, the U.S. government has been saying North Korea is one area that the U.S. and China can cooperate. Mr. Revere, is it now difficult to expect such cooperation?
Indeed it is. It's probably more difficult than it has been in many years. We're no longer in 2017 when the Chinese were willing to cooperate with us in squeezing North Korea. We've come a long way since then. I think the Chinese, somewhat cynically, see an advantage to the situation that we now see unfolding on the Korean Peninsula, and see an opportunity to make inroads in their relations with both Koreas and to undermine the overall presence of the United States in Northeast Asia. And so I think as much as I would like to see the Chinese cooperate with us on North Korea, I think that ship has sailed. We're in a different place right now, and eliciting Chinese cooperation on North Korea going forward is going to be a really tough thing to do.
Mr. Klingner, without U.S. and China cooperation, is it difficult to see any progress in the Korean issue anytime soon?
I've been focusing on the Korean Peninsula for 28 years, and it's always difficult to expect progress on not only the nuclear problem, but on improving the conditions for the North Korean people and human rights, et cetera. I think it's incorrect, though, to depict the rise in tensions in the U.S.-Chinese relationship as a reason for suddenly China not being helpful on the Korean Peninsula. They've never been helpful. They've been part of the problem rather than part of the solution. It's the U.S. and its allies that have to try to address the issues on the peninsula. We can hope that China will be helpful, but we can't count on that.
At the Summit for Democracy, President Biden urged other countries to stand up for the democratic values such as justice, the rule of law, and the free speech. Whether these democratic countries will be able to solidify a unified position has yet to be seen. Mr. Revere and Mr. Klingner, Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having us.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.